I'm just going to talk you through a few of the most important points from the chapter we read out of Sapolsky's book Behave. So, here we're really getting to know the prefrontal cortex. So, Sapolsky acquaints us with a whole host of skills performed by the prefrontal cortex. And of course, now that we're discussing the cortex, these skills are being performed consciously with your intention, effort, and awareness, as opposed to the work that the brain is doing for you in the lower layers below the level of your conscious awareness. So, some of the skills that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for is working memory that helps you remember something from one moment to the next, executive function, which is really kind of a meta skill related to organizing your knowledge, deciding what steps to use when you're doing a task, and choosing your actions based on a long term plan instead of an immediate impulse or urge. The frontal cortex is really in play when you choose to forego gratification in the moment in the pursuit of a longer term reward. So, right now, you're sitting at your computer watching a video of me, which is probably not the funnest thing you could be doing, but it fits with your long term goals of getting your degree. And you can thank your frontal cortex for giving you the willpower to do that. And thank you for being here. And the frontal cortex plays a special role in reining in impulses and regulating emotion. So it's almost as if you were to imagine the brain as a horse-drawn carriage, you could imagine the horses in the front are the reward system and the amygdala. They're constantly pulling the carriage in different directions based on emotion, and the prefrontal cortex is the driver who's sitting there with the reins and keeping those animals in check and keeping them moving towards the long term goal that he's decided on. Sapolsky reminds us that the prefrontal cortex is the very last region of the brain to come fully online, and it isn't totally formed until mid 20s. It's also really crucial to regulating our attention. And one of the great myths of human life is the idea that there's such a thing as multitasking. The fact is, the lower regions of the brain, the limbic system and the brainstem, are totally capable of multitasking. Right now, while you're paying attention to this lecture, your medulla is regulating your breathing and heart rate without your mind being on it at all. And we know that, for instance, your enteric nervous system is hard at work right now managing the process of digestion without your conscious input or awareness. But when it comes to conscious processes, we can really only handle one at once. Anytime that you feel like you're multitasking, you're actually just switching very quickly between different tasks. And this switching comes at a cost. Every time that you have to switch your attention from one task to another, that taxes your executive function a little bit, and it takes away from your performance on both of the tasks. It can also make you a little frayed emotionally. So I noticed when I had a small kid that I had to stop trying to listen to podcasts while I was making dinner because I would snap at my kid if they came in and interrupted me. And my brain just had too much going on, and none of my frontal cortex was left to do that important piece of regulating emotion. Because it's my frontal cortex that reminds me I want to use a pleasant voice when I'm speaking to my child, even when they're getting on my last nerve. So Polsky really dives into this inherent limitation of our beautiful frontal cortex, and that is that it is a very expensive region of the brain to run. We already know that the brain itself is greedy calorically, sucking down a fifth of the calories we need in a day, and the prefrontal cortex in particular is very expensive. Those cells consume a lot of energy doing their tasks, and that area of the brain can get worn out. So you may have felt this leaving an exam or some other really mentally, cognitively challenging task. That's always the moment you forget where you've parked your car or make a silly slip up because that piece of your brain is just literally tired. Many of us feel the effects of the prefrontal cortex's heavy metabolism when we make our nighttime impulsive choices. After a long day of regulating impulses and keeping your emotions in check, the prefrontal cortex may be kind of worn out by the end of the day. And that's often when people eat foods they don't intend to eat, text people they don't intend to text, and have other lapses in judgment because the part of their brain that usually keeps them on track is tired. Sapolsky beautifully discussed the role of the prefrontal cortex in social behavior, gave us the case of Phineas Gage, and I think a lot of that was clear, so I'm not going to talk about it. But I do want to discuss the area of the text where he gets into two different subregions of the prefrontal cortex, because I think there were a lot of acronyms flying around in this section, might have been a bit confusing. So this is a really interesting part of the text, but it also gets a bit wordy. Um, Sapolsky introduces us to two subregions of the prefrontal cortex. Yes, this massive and important part of the brain is complex enough that there are subregions within it, each contributing to its ultimate decision. So, one of the areas he mentions is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And you may remember from the overview that the Kolb text gave us on orientation within the brain that dorsal means the top side and lateral means out to the side. So, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex would be out here, kind of where I have put this yellow sticky tab. And this region of the brain is particularly concerned with rule following and logic. In contrast, the other brain region that Sapolsky also introduces, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is the bridge between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. Just as the hypothalamus was sort of that bridge between layer 1, the brainstem, and layer 2, the limbic system, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is the connection between the cortical areas and the limbic system itself. So ventral in brain anatomy terms means down on the bottom, and medial means inside. So to see the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, we kind of have to open the brain up a little bit, and then it's sitting right down here. So let me put another post-it on it. We'll mark this region down here in purple. It's not super important that you remember the wordy names of these brain regions, but it will help you get an idea of all of the complexity that's going on inside your prefrontal cortex if we kind of imagine them as characters in your internal debate. I probably shouldn't admit this because it's so dorky, but I'm a huge fan of Star Trek The Next Generation. So I'm going to use that as my comparison. So in Star Trek, everybody's out on a spaceship exploring the galaxy, and there's a captain who's in charge. So the captain, Captain Picard, would be sort of like the prefrontal cortex as a whole. And the captain makes all of the important decisions for the ship, but he listens to other members of the bridge crew, which are like the subregions of the prefrontal cortex that give information to the captain and help him make his decisions. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex up here, DLPFC from the text, would be like Lieutenant Commander Data, who's an android on the starship, and he has no emotions. He's a perfect rule follower, perfect at logic, and he always suggests that the crew take the most logical approach to any of the many space conundrums they find themselves in from week to week. And sometimes his perfectly logical suggestions really surprise the humans on board. For instance, he thinks that it's reasonable to sacrifice one person for many, and so he volunteers quite often to sacrifice himself for the good of the crew, a decision that would be harder for us emotional beings to make. In contrast, down here, the ventromedial PFC, VLPFC, the sort of bridge to the limbic system, the more emotional part of the prefrontal cortex, I would compare to the ship's counselor, Deanna Troi. So while Data is feeding Captain Picard all of the logical ideas about what the crew should do and how they should respond to situations, it's Counselor Troy, who comes in with emotional information. She's an empath, and so a lot of times she tips Picard off to things that he might not know. She tells him that other aliens are probably lying, or she gives him psychological insight into motivations of creatures they encounter. So she's sort of helping him use emotional information in his ultimate decision. Sapolsky discusses a classic experimental paradigm in psychology called the trolley problem. To jog your memory on this scenario, here's a short video clip explaining the trolley problem.
A runaway train is heading towards 5 workers on a railway line. There's no way of warning them, but you're standing near a lever that operates some points. Switch the points, and the train goes down a spur. Trouble is, there's another worker on that bit of track too, but it's 1 fatality instead of 5. Should you do that? Many people think the right thing to do would be to switch the points, to sacrifice 1 to save 5, since that produces the best outcome possible. Now imagine the train heading for the workers again. This time it can only be stopped by pushing a very large man off a bridge. His great bulk would stop the train, but he'd die. Should you do that? Most people say no. But why not? Both thought experiments are cases of sacrificing 1 to save 5.
So, as neuroscientists, what we're really interested in when we consider the trolley problem is which brain regions are lighting up when folks are faced with these two slightly different versions of the same choice. In the first version of the trolley problem, where all you have to do to execute your decision is pull a lever, we see that it's the dorsolateral PFC, the DLPFC, this sort of logical android of the prefrontal cortex is the only region that's lighting up. We are thinking about sacrificing 1 person to save 5 in this abstract sense where all that is required of us is pulling a lever, then we're using only our logical mind. But when you ask a slightly different version of the question where now the action of pushing someone off the bridge is required, suddenly the limbic system has a lot to say. Our insula lights up at the moral disgust. Our amygdala is probably firing up with some sort of angry or fearful reaction. And all of that information makes its way to the prefrontal cortex down here through the ventral medial PFC. Counselor Troy in my analogy. So this region of the brain is quiet when folks are just thinking about the first version of the trolley problem, pulling a lever only, but it lights up a lot when they think about the version of the problem, which includes pushing someone off the bridge. And this difference in activity in the prefrontal cortex perfectly predicts who chooses what in the trolley problem. So the more that the emotional ventromedial PFC lit up while subjects were thinking about the trolley problem's second case, the more likely they were to say they would never push the man off the bridge. Experimenters have performed the trolley problem with individuals whose ventromedial PFC, that emotional center of the prefrontal cortex, was damaged. Left with only the logical DLPFC to feed their reasoning, folks with ventromedial PFC damage were likely to say that they should push someone off a bridge to save 5 people on the train tracks, even if the person they were going to end up pushing was their own child. Towards the end of the chapter, Sapolsky gets into really interesting territory where he discusses the relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system deeper in the brain. So the prefrontal cortex plays a big role in regulating our emotions by regulating activity in the limbic system. Whenever you have an emotional reaction that you don't want to act on or show on your face, it's the prefrontal cortex that allows you to tamp down that emotional expression or even to tamp down the sensation of emotion itself and kind of talk yourself out of the way that you've been feeling. Sapolsky gives an example of an experiment where the volunteer participant is made to feel left out. So this work comes from a scientist named Naomi Eisenberger who works at UCLA. In this experiment, folks come into a brain imaging lab, so they're laying down in a functional MRI so we can see which regions of their brain are active during the experiment. As they're laying there in the brain scanner, they're playing a video game. They think that they're playing with 2 other real people. It's a very simple game, and you're supposed to just be passing a ball around. and participants think that the brain scanner is looking at something about their motor control, but actually it's looking at their prefrontal cortex and limbic system as it studies their emotions when they're manipulated to feel excluded. So what happens is the other two players in the game, who are actually just the computer, but you as a participant think they're real, start passing the ball just between themselves. You're stuck sitting in a brain scanner in the middle of a game of keep away, just as obnoxious as a playground bully would have staged it back in middle school. Now, what happens when you are excluded by these other participants and they start playing keep away right over your head? Immediately, your amygdala fires up. Remember, the amygdala is very much on alert for social threats, and being excluded like this isn't something that the limbic system takes lightly. As the amygdala fires up, you either feel anxious. Am I doing something wrong? Do I smell? Why are they leaving me out? Or you feel angry. These jerks, did no one teach them sportsmanship? What happens in neurotypical adults just one moment later is we see the prefrontal cortex light up and it sends inhibitory messages to calm down the amygdala. So you're talking yourself out of feeling upset about what's going on. You're probably saying to yourself something like, maybe there's some kind of glitch, or hey, it's just a game, who cares? This isn't important. So the prefrontal cortex is coming online to help the amygdala calm down in this situation of social exclusion. A really interesting aspect of Eisenberger's work is that when she did the same experiment with teens, the prefrontal cortex was nowhere to be found. So that pain of the social exclusion stayed just as hot and fiery from moment one of the experiment to the end. Teens didn't experience relief from the prefrontal cortex calming the amygdala.